Hello, this lecture is going to cover the first two presidencies of Washington and John Adams. Washington, of course, established what it meant to be president. His was also a largely uneventful presidency, thanks in part to the new powers of the government that actually allowed it to handle problems, and also to Washington's planning and leadership. But there was still some controversy. The controversy, though, really exploded with his successor, John Adams. Adams demonstrated that the power of the new federal government and the potential problems that power could lead to, as well as kind of foreshadowing a few future political disputes. Once Washington was sworn in as president and the new government was set up, the main concern of the new United States was to avoid another war. Europe was awash in bloodshed for much of Washington's presidency with the French Revolutionary Wars, and Europe would be fighting for quite some time because there was the French Revolutionary Wars, then the Napoleonic Wars, which basically meant that England and France were fighting against each other for about 25 years with just maybe 1 or 2 years of a break in between a couple of these wars. There's a series of them. So staying out of all that mess was the most important thing for the United States. The United States could not survive another war while still recovering from the Revolution, and Washington knew that the new nation would very likely disintegrate if it was faced with the challenge of a new war. At the same time, however, the U.S. had problems with the British still. The British had not followed all of the agreements in the Peace of Paris, and it pretty much continued to act as if Americans were still English and belonged to the English. So the British kept forts in the West that they were supposed to give up, and Americans were afraid that they were going to arm Native Americans in the West. They would eventually actually do that. The British had not reopened trade with Americans, so continued to stop trading with Americans. The Royal Navy was impressing American citizens, not impress wow, that's amazing. Impress as in to press into military service against their will. So the British Royal Navy was running around and stopping American ships and taking American sailors and saying, okay, you're in the Royal Navy now because we think you're still English, actually. So Americans were not happy about that. That was a big problem. To solve all this, or an attempt to, Washington sent John Jay, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court didn't really have anything to do yet. It hadn't discovered what its job was yet, so he didn't have anything better to do. But Washington didn't send his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, which was kind of an awkward thing. Secretary of State, that's sort of their job to negotiate treaties and diplomacy and stuff like that. But Washington did so because Jefferson was pro-French, and kind of that's where his sympathies lied, and he was anti-British, whereas Washington and Washington's followers, like Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, John Jay, they all favored the British, even after the Revolution. So they feared what was happening with the French Revolution. They feared that kind of radical democracy that happened with the French Revolution. And they were still culturally British, even if they had tried to, have the revolution and break away. That's who they were. So Jay negotiated this so-called Jay's Treaty, that's what people called it, with the British in 1794. And he did get the British to agree to trade with Americans, to resume that, and to not have a war. So, but the British didn't agree to remove the forts. They didn't agree to stop impressing American sailors, and they continued to do that. And that would continue to be a problem. And they still didn't really, so they had recognized America with the Peace of Paris, but they were acting like they didn't acknowledge America to be an independent country. And they didn't, change that with this Jay's Treaty. So Jefferson and his followers, which included many, many Americans, argued that America still had an alliance with the French dating back to the American Revolution when the French had helped us out. And so we owed it to the French not to work with the British like this or trade with them. We had fought a war against the British, so why should we try to trade with them and kind of beg and grovel to do so, which is how Jefferson and his followers perceived this treaty. So Jay's treaty was very unpopular in the United States amongst a lot of people. So unpopular that people hung Jay in effigy. So again, that means they were like making a straw man that looked like him and then hanging that as kind of a threat. And even the hero George Washington, who's kind of, you'll read about in Revolutionary Characters, kind of like has a reputation that's beyond reproach, and everybody loves him. Even Washington was criticized for this treaty, not as much as John Jay was, but Washington was not, spared some of this criticism. He was the president after all, and this was not something a lot of Americans liked. This treaty was still approved by the Senate, though, and it did buy America time without having to fight the British again, which would happen again later over a lot of these same issues, and would have been really, really bad to try to do in the 1790s. That the United States was just not ready for that, so it was unpopular, but it might have been in some ways kind of necessary. The other important event of Washington's presidency was called the Whiskey Rebellion, which sounds way more fun than it actually was, so sorry. This rebellion happened because Alexander Hamilton thought that the new federal government needed to demonstrate that it had the power to tax, to raise money and to tax, everyone in the United States. That's what everybody had fought against Parliament taxing everybody in the colonies. So he wants to prove, okay, we've got this new constitution. It says we can tax them, and darn it, we're gonna do this. So he got a tax on whiskey passed. Partly to raise revenue, partly just to prove that, okay, Congress can raise these taxes. And this tax on whiskey that was passed, it was made higher on small whiskey producers than on large ones. And it was a tax on whiskey, not because whiskey was like, super important because everybody was alcoholics. Farmers in the western portion of the United States had a hard time shipping all of the grain that they grew. So they distilled it down into whiskey. So it'd be much easier to ship, bottles of whiskey. That's, you take a bunch of grain that would be in huge barrels and really heavy and hard to transport. You need to distill it down into just the whiskey. And that's maybe worth as much, worth the same amount as all that corn, but it is much easier to transport. So that's why whiskey was important, not because they're raging alcoholics. But it's higher tax on the small farmers because they didn't have the power. Large farmers or large, whiskey producers had political power, and so they got lower rates. So farmers in western Pennsylvania got very angry about this tax, unsurprisingly. They said they wouldn't pay it, and they rebelled to stop any of the tax collection. So similar kind of thing as Shays' Rebellion. This kind of rebellion was exactly what led to the Constitution being created, and this kind of challenge was precisely what Hamilton and Washington kind of wanted to prove that the new government could handle. So they were trying to assert their authority to raise taxes. That authority is being challenged, so they're going to deal with this. So Washington put together an army to stop this Whiskey Rebellion, one that was actually larger than the Continental Army ever was. And he personally led it out to western Pennsylvania to put a stop to everything. And the rebellion, unsurprisingly, stops before his army even arrives because, people are intimidated into giving up this rebellion, which is the whole point of what Washington's doing. He doesn't want to have to fight. He would much rather people just say, okay, you have the power to tax. So mission accomplished. So the new government had proved that it could deal with these kind of problems and assert its authority. With this Whiskey Rebellion and the aftermath of it. The most important thing, though, about Washington's presidency was probably the end of his presidency, which isn't an insult, saying like he wasn't important or that he wasn't a good president. It's just, the precedents that he set were very important. So Washington knew he was setting precedents that would, set what it means to be president in the minds of people, for better or worse. So he knew that he needed to set a good example. He could have easily run for a third term as president. There was no rule about that yet. That limit that you can only run for 2 terms as president, that didn't get put into the Constitution until after World War II. So, he could have run again, and everybody would have still voted for him because he was George Washington. He also knew, though, that many people had feared that the president under the Constitution would end up as a tyrant, or that America would end up with a kind of permanent monarchy. So you'll read about that in Revolutionary Characters. He had resisted being called Your Highness in favor of being called just simply Mr. President for that very reason, that he doesn't want people thinking that he's some kind of hereditary king or even, a president for life kind of situation, which lots of countries develop a constitution and supposedly have democracy and elections for presidents, but they have presidents for life and they don't really have democracy. So that's happened to a lot of other countries, and Washington knew that was a possibility, and he wanted to avoid that kind of problems. So he declined to run again after 2 terms as president. He didn't run for a 3rd term. And as part of this, he wrote a farewell address that was published all around the country that contained some very important kind of messages, some of which were heeded for generations of Americans, some of which were ignored immediately. So it had a big impact, but maybe not quite as much as Washington hoped. His message of avoiding permanent alliances and trying to keep out of European affairs was basically followed until World War I. So this is why the United States, very reluctantly gets involved in World War I and World War II, and before that had tried to, as much as possible, to stay out of European politics and European wars. In the 20th century, we start to reluctantly get involved, and now, we're knee-deep or maybe even higher in the world's affairs. But Washington had told us to avoid these sorts of things, so people had listened to that for a long time. His message on political parties, though, which he saw as a threat to democracy and to the United States, was not listened to at all, basically. The United States was already developing its first 2 political parties, so the Federalists, who originated to get the Constitution ratified. The Federalists were also characterized by them being kind of pro-British. They were pro-business and pro-trade instead of being more in favor of kind of agriculture. They were skeptical of people's power in democracy, so they wanted more power for kind of elites, less power for common people. And they favored a strong central government. So that was one party, was the Federalists. The other party was the Democratic Republicans. So Jefferson was the leader of the Democratic Republicans. These kind of originate out of the Anti-Federalist, and then they become their own. They kind of change their name once the fight over the Constitution is over, and now the Constitution has been adopted. They rename themselves sort of into the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans were pro-French. They were pro-democracy, so favored giving more rights and responsibilities to the common people in our democracy. They favored agriculture and kind of farmers and things like that. They wanted more power for states and maybe a little bit less power for the federal government. It's a little bit confusing because these Democratic Republicans, which we'll be talking about for much of the semester, sometimes people just called them Republicans at this time when it was the Federalist and Democratic Republicans. Sometimes the Democratic Republicans were just called the Republicans, but they were not the ancestor of the modern Republican Party. In fact, the Democratic Republicans, even though people just kind of to abbreviate things called them Republicans, they're the ancestor of the modern Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party, we'll talk about some of its evolution. The Democratic Party comes out of this Democratic Republican Party, so party that existed from the very beginning of the United States, basically. The modern Republican Party, the GOP, that doesn't come until later. We'll talk about the origins of that later. Washington said, no, we shouldn't have political parties. These are a bad idea. People were making them anyways. Well, Washington wasn't exactly above all of that either. He was clearly on the side of the Federalists, even though, they were forming a political party and he's the president and he didn't actually lead that party. But his closest aides and kind of advisors were the, founding members of that party and in control of that party. So Washington is not quite so innocent on this account. And that's part of the reason why his advice on this isn't exactly listened to. Still, though, after going through the 2016 election in America, I think, in America without political parties might sound pretty good to a lot of people, or maybe even most people, if we didn't have that kind of bickering. But that's the system we have, despite Washington's warnings. To succeed Washington, the election of 1796, which was pretty much the first, it's the first election since Washington, and Washington's election as president had been a foregone conclusion. Nobody had really contested him. So the election of 1796 is like the real first contested presidential election. Running in this election was the vice president and Federalist John Adams against the Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, who is the leader of the Democratic Republicans. Adams won the election, which meant he was president, and the second place finisher Jefferson was his vice president. So that was awkward. As I mentioned, that's the way they set it up, that the second place finisher would be vice president. That's what the Constitution said. They realized this is a pretty bad idea pretty much after this election. Because having those opposing parties that are both part of, the executive branch just is a recipe for all kinds of drama and chaos and things you don't want. As I said, think about Donald Trump with Hillary Clinton as his vice president. That would be insane. The biggest issue of Adams' presidency, besides Thomas Jefferson kind of undermining him as the vice president, was America's getting caught between the French and the British in their wars that are still going on. So they started during Washington's presidency, still going on during John Adams' presidency. They will continue on into the next presidency. So we'll talk about that more in the next one. So just keep that in mind, that in Europe they're fighting like crazy. So despite Jay's Treaty, America did still have that alliance with France, that it was, technically in place. It was on paper. We had never said, no, we don't have this alliance anymore. But, the French people had kind of cut off their king's head. We had signed this agreement with the French monarchy, and now the monarchy is, having their head rolling on the ground. And they had created a new kind of government. So does that really count? People in the Federalist Party said, no, we can ignore it because they cut off the king's head. Democratic Republicans said, no way. That's, the French are doing what we did. They're having a revolution. Yay, democracy. So there was a little bit of argument over that. But John Adams is a Federalist, so he wants to side with the British. The United States mostly had problems with the British trying to impress American soldiers, but we had problems with the French as well. So both sides in that European war were trying to get the United States to kind of help out or to stop helping their enemy, and so they're kind of interfering with our trade and what we perceive to be as our rights. And Jay's Treaty had really angered the French. That, is perceived by the French as, okay, the United States is helping the British despite having a treaty with us. So that's a reason to be angry at the United States. So all of this problems going on, this led to something called the XYZ affair. So we don't have to get into every blow by blow, but so the XYZ affair, this was when some French kind of negotiators approached the United States with a proposal. So they said if the United States would trade more with France and stop trading with England, that France would give the United States a $10 million loan, so we still need money, so they'd give us a loan. But the United States had to pay a bribe of $250,000 to these French agents who were identified as agents X, Y, and Z. So there's three of them, and they were kind of codenamed X, Y, and Z. So that's why it's the XYZ affair. So this sort of corruption that was the sort of thing that Americans hated about Europe. It was exposed in newspapers and things. And so there were congressional hearings denouncing this, and Federalists were so upset that they wanted to go to war with France. The United States did not actually declare war against France, But there was still kind of some fighting with France, even though Congress didn't say, okay, we're officially at war. We did have some fighting, and this was called the quasi-war. So quasi means like it's sort of a war. So this is the quasi-war. It's like we sort of have a war, sort of not, because it wasn't official. So in order to stop the French Navy from impressing American sailors, which they were doing just like the British had, the United States began arming merchant ships and also created the U.S. Navy for the first time. And actually started using those armed merchant ships and the U.S. Navy against the French. So there were actual naval battles between French and American naval ships. There was no fighting on land. It was all at sea, but and there was no actual declaration of war. So that's why it's a quasi-war. So we're kind of fighting, on the ocean, but we're kind of not fighting, not all the way. As part of this quasi-war, Adams and the Federalists passed some laws to support the war. These laws were quite draconian, though, meaning very strict and harsh and that sort of thing. So these laws were the Alien and Sedition Acts. And they were passed in 1798. The Alien Acts, there's one concerning friendly aliens, and one concerning enemy aliens, and not like little green men, like people from outside the United States kind of aliens. So the Alien Acts gave the president the power to deport any aliens the government deemed dangerous with no due process. So if the president said that guy is dangerous, that non-American is dangerous, they could be deported from the United States right away with no kind of no legal proceedings to protect them. The Sedition Act made it a crime to conspire to oppose any government law or action. In other words, under the Sedition Act, it became against the law to write or publish anything criticizing the American government or its actions during this war. So even if it wasn't related to the war, if you criticized John Adams, that was a violation of the Sedition Act, and you could be thrown in jail. So this is a pretty clear violation of the First Amendment and the right to free speech. So pretty clearly unconstitutional. But remember, the Supreme Court isn't exactly checking on whether things are constitutional or not yet. That system hasn't been figured out. And the Federalists passed this law, so it was on the books, and people were thrown in jail for saying mean things about the president, which is kind of scary. Federalists also passed what was called the Nationalization Act, which made it so that somebody had to be in the United States 14 years before they could get citizenship. So very, very long time. It had been 5 years. They said if you lived in the United States for 5 years, okay, you can become an American citizen. This changed it to 14 years. Obviously, that's changed since then. There's different rules in place now, but they were doing this, again, to limit people coming into the United States that they perceived could potentially be enemies of the United States. Democratic Republicans were furious at these blatantly unconstitutional and undemocratic laws that were essentially aimed right at the Democratic Republicans. So this was a very ugly partisan conflict, and the Federalists were using their government, their government power that they had in office unfairly and illegally these were very much the whole point of them. So I said, they're trying to stop any, non-Americans who they think might be dangerous. But what it's really trying to do is undercut the Democratic Republican Party, especially that Sedition Act, but the other ones as well, because the Democratic Republican Party was drawing a lot of its support from recent immigrants to the United States who are, getting their citizenship. And this was, not only were Democratic Republicans upset just because this was targeted at them, but they believed, this was exactly what the Democratic Republicans, why they had opposed the Constitution before, that they thought it gave the federal government too much power to do things like this, to suppress political enemies just because you could, just because you had the power to and nobody could stop you. So Jefferson, the vice president and the leader of the Democratic Republicans, led the opposition to these laws, including with the what are known as the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. The states of Virginia and Kentucky passed resolutions saying that they would nullify these laws. So nullify meaning they would cancel these laws. So these states were saying that they weren't going to follow the federal law, which of course, as federal government and our, government system is set up now, federal law is above state law in most regards. And Jefferson himself wrote these Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, not publicly, so he kind of secretly wrote them and had other people, propose them before the state assemblies of Virginia and Kentucky, but he was kind of the mastermind behind this. And he's the vice president that's attacking the government for these laws. The Democratic-Republican Party was highly energized by these Alien Sedition Acts, so these laws really made them angry and kind of decide to organize more, gave them a lot of energy, and so they really had the upper hand when the election of 1800 was coming up, where John Adams was up for re-election. Okay, so next time we'll talk about that election, this so-called Revolution of 1800, because it resulted in such an important shift in our democracy. And we'll talk about the presidencies of Jefferson and his successor, James Madison. So we'll see you then.